Your Excellency, Mr. Santiago Mourâo, President of the 41st session of UNESCO General Conference, Your Excellency, Ms. Natasha Cayer, Ambassador and Permanent Delegate of Canada to UNESCO, Your Excellency, Minister Luís Roberto Barroso, Justice of the Brazilian Supreme Court, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this Brainboost session on freedom of expression, disinformation, and democracy. The rule of law and the right to freedom of expression are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. As a cornerstone of democratic societies, freedom of expression is essential to achieve openness, accountability, and transparency. Through the exercise of this right, it is possible to ensure a well-informed citizenry and to hold those in power to account, thus enhancing the rule of law. Freedom of expression is not only important as a self-standing right, enshrined in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is also crucial to enable the enforcement of other fundamental rights, such as political rights, including the right to vote and the right of assembly. Elections constitute a key moment in political life as they allow citizens to express their choices and designate their political representatives who will shape the present and future of their countries. It is therefore crucial that the public is informed in an accurate way and from a plurality of sources of the political choices that are available to them. We know very well the challenges that characterize our current information landscape. Widespread misinformation and disinformation are often instrumentalized during election times to sow division, target certain groups, or seek political gain. It is for these reasons that UNESCO addresses misinformation and disinformation through a human rights-based approach. We advocate for aligning national laws and policies that are aimed at addressing disinformation with international standards on freedom of expression. We also stress the need for building greater societal resilience to the harms of misinformation and disinformation, including through media and information literacy. On the other hand, courts also play an essential role in the protection of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and access to information, thereby upholding the respect for the rule of law and other fundamental freedoms. Through courts' decisions, judges guarantee the implementation of freedom of expression standards, contribute to a safe environment for media and journalists, strengthen the rule of law, and ensure a higher level of transparency from public actors by improving the access to public information. Within the framework of the UNESCO Judges Initiative, we are proud to say that since 2013, we have, with our partners, trained over 23,000 judicial actors in 150 countries. In the same line, UNESCO is also reinforcing the capacities of electoral practitioners on international standards and best practices on these issues to guarantee free, plural, and fair elections by fostering freedom of expression, including press freedom and public access to information. In this regard, I am pleased to announce the launch of UNESCO Handbook on Media and Elections. This manual, addressed to electoral practitioners and key actors involved in elections, outlines emerging issues linked to the opportunities and risks posed by the internet, social media, and AI in connection to elections and democracy. It also provides good practice examples and recommendations in different electoral settings. This handbook will be included as a baseline content material in the upcoming UNESCO Massive Open Online course on elections in digital times. We'll be shortly launching this manual. Today's discussion, focusing on freedom of expression, disinformation, and democracy, will foster dialogue among peers to explore how these concepts are interlinked. It will further explore the best ways to enhance the role of the judiciary and electoral operators to guarantee freedom of expression and, more broadly, to ensure the rule of law and the respect of human rights. Before I close, I would like to express my special gratitude to the Freedom Online Coalition and the Permanent Delegation of Canada for the cooperation in organizing this conference. UNESCO is pleased to join efforts with its valuable partners to promote freedom of expression, access to information, and the safety of journalists. Without indulging any further, I am pleased to give the floor now to Her Excellency, Madame Natasha Cayer, Ambassador and Permanent Delegate of Canada to UNESCO.
Thank you, ADG Jelassi, and let me say it's a great pleasure to be here today with you all for this Brainboost session on freedom of expression, disinfo, and democracy. As in my capacity as the responsible delegation for the chairmanship of the Freedom Online Coalition, we're particularly engaged on this issue, and we are very happy to see members of the coalition group of friends here today in such great numbers. I'd like to also just thank ADG Jelassi and Brazil for organizing this event, and notably to thank Justice Barroso for being with us today to share his observations on this extremely important topic. As the current chair of the FOC, Canada has, of course, been trying to advance a shared vision of digital inclusion as a way forward to ensure the viability of our democracies and to ensure, in doing that, that we have an informed and engaged public that can participate meaningfully in society, both online and offline. We know that the integrity of information, whether online or offline, is a critical component of democracy, and countering the spread of disinfo has been one of Canada's priorities. As others, we're acutely aware of the fact that an increasing number of states are actively employing disinformation as one of a number of tactics to erode democracy, that within their own societies and often within other societies in other states. It's also being used to erode the commitment of individuals and states to our international system and the rules-based order in which we all depend. This has been seen as particularly pernicious of late during elections, with foreign state-sponsored entities seeking to influence electoral outcomes, sow division, and again, erode confidence in democratic values, institutions, and processes. So we need to ensure, and we need to work together, UNESCO needs to work on this as well, to try to make sure that societies can maintain a shared set of facts. The shared sense that there is real information that is truthful and accessible as a foundation of democratic debate, as a means to hold governments accountable, other entities and institutions accountable. And so I look very much forward today to hearing from Justice Barroso on this important topic in terms of his experience and what Brazil has seen, and to a lively discussion amongst all of those who are present both here in the room and online in this hybrid format that we have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We are very pleased having you with us, and we look forward to furthering our cooperation. I would like now to introduce His Excellency Mr. Santiago Irazabal Mourâo, President of UNESCO General Conference. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning to all. His Excellency Luís Roberto Barroso, Minister of Justice of the Supreme Court, Federal Court of Brazil, and former President of the Superior Electoral Court in Brazil. This is Natasha Cayer, my friend, my good friend, Ambassador and Permanent Delegate of Canada to UNESCO, Chair of Freedom Online Coalition. Mr. Tawfik Jelassi, Assistant Director General for Communication and Information of UNESCO. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a special pleasure to welcome at UNESCO Minister Luís Roberto Barroso, a strong advocate of freedom of expression. I believe that the presence of Minister Barroso here embodies the importance of judiciary and law representative to protect a fundamental human right in these fast-changing times. Freedom of expression is indeed crucial to ensure good governance and the rule of law, to consolidate just and cohesive societies to advance sustainable development and peace. However, as we have seen in the last year, this right has been incessantly threatened. We see this is the challenge faced by independent and pluralistic media. Today, journalism is one of the most dangerous professions across the world. It is also one of the most necessary activities for the protection of civilian lives and the construction of peace. The report on global trends in freedom of expression, recently launched by UNESCO, reveals that journalism has emerged weakened from the sanitary crisis, not only in economic terms, but also in terms of freedom and safety of its professionals. While there has been a slight decrease, and we have seen that, in the number of killings of journalists over the past 5 years, most of these crimes remain unsolved, and other methods of repression, such as arbitrary arrest, keep rising. The COVID pandemic has aggravated the situation, contributing to the climate of fear for media professionals, with a negative impact on the quality of their work. The use of digital technologies is offering great opportunities for freedom of expression, allowing more people to access, to produce, and share information. But it is also favoring deliberate attacks on the press, as well as the dissemination of false information. It is important, extremely important, not to confuse criticism of the media with hate speech, which has particularly been spread through social networks. Hate speeches is a crime and must be treated as such, and we need to support of the state institutions to fight against impunity. This is why they took the initiative on the occasion of the celebration of the World Press Freedom Day under the theme Journalism Under Digital Siege, to launch with presidents of the United Nations General Assembly and Human Rights Council a joint declaration. This document is a call for building a safer environment for journalists and media workers, as well as protecting the right of every citizen to have access to reliable information. I strongly believe that we need to do more to get this message out and reinforce our action on every possible occasion, especially in view of the forthcoming 10th anniversary of the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. More than ever, we need a strong commitment from states to advance policies and laws that preserve journalists from interference and threats, while also ensuring universal access to information, including through internet. Ladies and gentlemen, by supporting the Windhoek Declaration of 2021 in the last General Conference, Member States reaffirmed information as a public good and the role of UNESCO as the leading agency in the defense of freedom of expression in the UN system. In the last years, the organization has forwarded capacity-building activities and knowledge sharing in the search of a better balance between regulation, responsibility, and security in access to information. UNESCO has in particular worked to support the training of judges to sharpen the work of law enforcement professionals in line with the Objective 16 of the 2030 UN Agenda for Sustainable Development, promoting the advent of just, inclusive, and peaceful societies. It is in this spirit that UNESCO collaborated with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to undertake the first training program for justice professionals in Latin America in 2013. Likewise, the launch of the training course to support judicial operators from Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa, PALOPS, with the support of the Brazilian National School of Judges and Fund, last June, can be considered a fundamental step to benefit a region that is a global priority for UNESCO. We need to bolster initiatives like these to provide judges and magistrates from all regions with the necessary tools for fostering positive transformations. I'm convinced that it is through international cooperation, in particular North-South-South cooperation, that we will strengthen institutions and consolidate the path of a true culture of peace based on the freedom of expression. Therefore, I wish to thank again Minister Barroso and Ambassador Natasha Cayer and Mr. Jelassi for this meeting, and we will reinforce here the standing of UNESCO for the rights and values that all of us share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It's great to have you with us this morning at this important event. I would like now to welcome Honorable Minister Luís Roberto Barroso, Justice of the Supreme Federal Court of Brazil. We are honored to have you with us as our main guest today, and I'm sure that given your long experience and major expertise, your intervention will be highly beneficial to all of us present in this room, but also connected online to follow the session. Mr. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I greet you, Mr. Tawfik Jelassi, Ms. Natasha Cayer, and Mr. Santiago Mourâo. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to share with you all some ideas and some thoughts on this subject, freedom of expression, social media, and democracy. I'll try to make this as informal and light as possible, although it's a tough subject. And I have divided my presentation in basically 3 parts according to our title. So I want to talk a little bit about democracy and authoritarian populism, a little bit about the digital revolution, and then social media and freedom of expression. So I'll start with part 1, democracy and the rise of authoritarian populism. Democracy, as we all know, has been the winning ideology of the 20th century, having defeated all the alternatives that presented themselves: communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and religious fundamentalisms. And constitutional democracy means, in a very objective way, I would say, popular sovereignty, free election, rule of the majority, limited power, rule of the law, and protection of fundamental rights. And most constitutional democracies also have in their institutional arrangement either a Supreme Court or a constitutional court that arbitrates the tensions that quite often appear between the rule of the majority and the protection of fundamental rights and of the rule of the law. And furthermore, democracy these days are made of votes, fundamental rights, and reasons, meaning that democracy is not limited to the electoral process, but it also involves the protection of fundamental rights for everyone, as well as a permanent public debate that legitimizes, I would say, political decisions. Although democracy, as I said, was the winning ideology of the 20th century, as we all know, something seems not to be going very well in many parts of the world these days, with the rise what has been called authoritarian populism, which is an anti-pluralist and anti-institutional populist wave, I would say, that poses serious risks for democracy. Populism can be, as we all know, right-wing or left-wing, although what we've been watching in many parts of the world is the rise of a right-wing extremism, often racist, xenophobic, and homophobic. The hallmark of populism is the division of society in we, or us, the people, pure, decent, conservative, and they, the cosmopolitan, corrupt, liberal elites. And I should add that I think the rise of populism flows through the shortcomings of democracy, the unfulfilled promises of prosperity and opportunity for all. We won't have time to discuss what I would deem the causes of this rise of authoritarian populism. There are political causes, social causes, cultural identity causes. The strategies of populism in most part of the world have been a direct communication with their supporters, usually, more recently, using social media. The second strategy is bypassing or co-opting intermediary institutions like civil society, legislature, and the press. And in many parts of the world, very particularly, populism has meant attacks on Supreme Courts or constitutional courts, whose role is precisely to limit the power of the majority. The reason why I opened this first chapter on democracy and authoritarian populism was because authoritarian populism has been using as one of its main tools disinformation campaigns, hate speech, slander, lies, and conspiracy theories as their strategy. Many people will label this, I don't like this expression, under the label of fake news, but this is basically the strategy that's being used in different parts of the world. And the main problem, the main consequences of the use of fake news, I would say, is that it deceives voters, it violates fundamental rights, and it compromises free speech by tainting the public debate. So this is the basic scenario I would like to describe that we are living in many parts of the world. Of course, I won't cite examples. It wouldn't be proper in this environment, but we all know where these things are happening. And even in countries with very strong and consolidated democracies, we've had problems with this rise of the authoritarian populism. So I move on to our second chapter, which is the digital revolution, which is also a major part of the scenario I want to describe before we discuss specifically freedom of expression and social media. So we have all been living under the third industrial revolution, so-called the technological or digital revolution, which began in the middle of the 20th century. And it's characterized by the massification of personal computers, of smart cell phones, and most notably by the internet, connecting billions of people all over the planet. And the digital revolution has changed totally the way we live, the way we book a hotel, the way we buy merchandises, the way we listen to music. It has been a revolution in my lifetime, I think I could say. And we have all incorporated a new vocabulary with words that identify utilities and applications that until a couple years ago or a few years ago we didn't know, and without which we could not live any longer. And I made a short list here, Natasha: Google, Amazon. So for the younger people, life on Earth has been possible without Google until recently, I would say. WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Waze, Spotify. These days I got a message from Spotify saying, the songs you like are these. I said, thank you. Appreciate that. And Dropbox, iTunes, Netflix, and for those who are single, there's also Tinder. So we live in this brave new world of information technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, 3D printing, quantum computing, autonomous cars, and the Internet of Things. And strangely, algorithm has become the most important concept of our time, which is a word that until a couple years ago, nobody even knew, and it's even difficult to say it. And what's interesting, the most valuable companies until a few years ago were the companies that explore oil, like Exxon, Shell, or make cars like General Motors and Ford, or major equipments like General Electric. Well, none of them figure these days as the most valuable companies. As we all know, they are Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, with their new names, Meta and Alphabet. And now, because of the Ukrainian crisis, Aramco is the most valuable, but I think that's just occasionally. So this is the digital revolution that sometimes we don't realize it has changed so profoundly our lives, and with all the benefits and all the promises, with longevity, but with all the risks that we know that stem from artificial intelligence. And I just went through the recommendations of Unesco, a wonderful document on ethics and AI that I think we should all pay attention to. Artificial intelligence is the future, as we all know, with its promises and its risks of opacity, risks of discrimination, discriminatory effects, and risks of singularity, the machines taking over. Genetic engineering without its promises in the medicine field, with the risks of eugenics and the temptation that many scientists fear, that the humankind won't resist the temptation of trying to make people stronger, smarter, more handsome, and increasing inequalities, and reaching our main subject, the Internet, with all its promises, but also the risks of abuse by the practice of illicit or socially undesirable behaviors. So I now move to our third and final chapter, in which I want to discuss Internet, social media, and freedom of expression, which is basically the subject that gathers us here. The Internet revolutionized the world of interpersonal and social communication, and it has expanded exponentially the access of everyone to information, knowledge, and to the public space. And it's impossible to exaggerate the importance, the democratizing role of the Internet in having more people having access to knowledge and information. Before the Internet, dissemination of news and opinions relied basically on the professional press, because it was up to the press to gather facts, spread news, and very especially to filter news and opinions by the criteria of journalist ethics. So there was a minimum editorial control over the quality and veracity of what was published. Not that there were no problems, because the outlets were limited. They had owners, they had their own interests. But of course, I think we could say that there was a minimum degree of control over what became public. So the internet, with the emergence of websites, personal blogs, and above all, social media, enabled wide dissemination and circulation of ideas, opinions, and information with no filter. The negative consequence, however, is that it also allowed the spread of ignorance, lies, and the practice of crimes of different nature. And I want to make sure we can assess the way of social media these days, which was one of the most striking developments of the digital revolution. Facebook has nearly 3 billion accounts. YouTube has over 2 billion users, and WhatsApp, which is very popular in Brazil, I don't know about France, it's not so popular in the US, but in Brazil it's become very important, has 2 billion active users. So one should note that in their peak, newspapers and magazines would sell 1 million copies. Now we're talking about 3 billion people, 2.5 billion people, 2 billion people. So the scales have changed completely in the circulation of information and in the access to information. In Brazil, according to surveys, 79% of the population has WhatsApp as its main source of information. Television, who used to be the star in our times, Ambassador, is now the source of information of only 50% of the population. YouTube, 49%, Facebook, 44%, news site, 38%, and people like myself that still read newspapers, we are only 8% these days. So there has been a major shift of paradigm in access to information, and I think the most serious consequences of these phenomena I've been describing were that in the same way that it democratized access to information, which was very good and very important, it also allowed the unfiltered circulation of this information, the tribalization of lie, people that only talk to their equals, to people that think alike, which radicalize the public discourse and generates intolerance and incomprehension. And very important, a major crisis in the business model of the professional press. Around the world, magazines and newspapers have been shutting down in thousands. And of course, this is something that we should worry about, because I think this matter does not involve just a business activity that has suffered the disruptive impact of innovation. A free and strong press, as I think we all agree, is one of the pillars of democracy. And for this reason, I think we should discuss this as not as a matter of a private business, but as a matter of public interest. How to save, how to preserve the professional press these days. The problem with the lack of a professional press creating a public space where people can share objective facts has created a world where each group has its own narrative, and we cannot agree anymore on the facts. Until recently, we shared the facts and people had different opinions. These days, people have different facts, and when you have different facts, it's very difficult to communicate, to have a good interlocution, and that's the way to misunderstanding, and that's the way to violence. And one point I would like to stress here that I think it's very important. Social media have become the main source of information for most people, but they do not produce content. So it's the professional press that produces content. So it's necessary to rethink what's going on, because all the revenue, all the advertising has moved to the technological platforms. So there is a weakening of the professional press, and so there is a weakening in the production of reliable, ethical information. And I think for people that are worried about freedom of expression and freedom of the press, this is something we should think about. Some countries are experiencing sharing revenues between technological platforms and the professional press by statutory determination. I'm not saying this is the best model, but I think this is something we must consider, how to preserve and fund professional press these days. I think that's very important. One interesting thing about the internet and the social media is that at the beginning, there was this impression that it should be a space free of regulation, both from an economic and commercial point of view, as well as from the perspective of freedom of speech. So the key words at the beginning were the internet should be free, open, and unregulated. I think these days no one agrees that this is possible anymore, because many concerns developed over the years, and now I think we are all convinced that the internet regulation has become a consensus with approaches in different areas, like in the economic area, for antitrust legislation, consumer protection, fair taxation, copyright protection. It needs to be regulated for those purposes. It needs to be regulated, and it's being regulated for purposes of privacy, restricting the use of users' information and data without their consent. Those platforms these days, they know everything about us. They know where we live, how much we make, what are our concerns, what we've been searching, where we've been traveling to, and that's a very important data that could be misused. So most countries in Europe, in the US, and Brazil, there's now statutes and regulations curbing the use of information, especially after the Cambridge Analytica scandal that we all know. And in the third place, it needs to be regulated to fight inauthentic behavior and content control in some cases, and also to establish platform liability rules. So the whole world is now dealing with finding the proper balance between, on one hand, protecting freedom of expression, and on the other hand, finding the right point of balance to avoid the use of the internet for illicit purposes. In an environment like this, I don't have to stress the importance of freedom of expression. I have highlighted 3 reasons why in many countries this has become, or in most countries, it has become a fundamental right, and in many countries it has become a preferential freedom. And the reasons are the importance of freedom of expression for the search of possible truth, of course in a plural world and in an open society, but the search for the possible truth is very important to record history and the culture of a people. Second, because freedom of expression is an essential element of human dignity. People's personality wants to be expressed, and freedom of expression is the way of conveying ideas and opinions and being oneself. And in third place, its importance for democracy, for the public debate. So content regulation cannot undermine freedom of expression, and quite the opposite, it must be aimed at its protection, and all censorship is suspect. However, it's necessary to take into account that in the digital age, some of the same foundations that traditionally justified the reinforced protection of freedom of expression, the search for truth, human dignity, and democracy, these same foundations can justify its regulation to fight inauthentic behaviors. And by that, I mean the use of automated systems like robots, bots, fake profiles, and hired people, trolls, to forge engagement or drown out third-party speech. That's a very important issue, inauthentic behavior. Because if someone posts something, a lie or a misinformation, and he or she has 10 or 20 followers, it's a problem, but it's not a major problem. But if you can amplify artificially that message to reach thousands or millions of people, then it becomes much more dangerous. So the main target that we should try to fight is unauthentic behavior, more than content. But secondly, illegal content that involves terrorism, child sexual abuse, incitement to crime and violence, hateful or discriminatory speech, as our ambassador has mentioned, anti-democratic attacks, which has become a problem in countries like Brazil. Besides that, disinformation itself, which consists of deliberate creation and dissemination of false news, generally with the purpose of obtaining personal gain, political, economic, or personal, and causing harm to others. I have three observations that I think it's important. First, in the world that we lived before, in which our main source of communication were the traditional media, the dispute was for space, for access to the public space. This is not the problem anymore. These days, the difficulty is to catch the attention of the crowd, of the people. So that's an important observation. The second, and it's kind of sad for the human condition, is that according to a study, false, defamatory, and sensationalist content which sparks anger or expresses hatred, produce much more engagement than rational, moderate speech. That's very sad to acknowledge, but that's a fact. And the third observation is the fact that hate, lies, and sensationalism brings more engagement. These facts give the platforms the wrong incentives to amplify these type of posts, these type of information. So I'm coming to an end. I think we all need to agree that some kind of regulation is necessary. Europe is discussing this. The DSA is going to become effective. In Brazil, we are discussing this. It's not very easy to moderate content and to regulate social media. It's always a danger for freedom of expression. We need to be very, very careful. And the way I see it, besides state regulation that we actually need, I think self-regulation will play a very, very important role. I think the platforms must be proactive in moderating content, and in doing this, Transparency is required, due process is required, fairness is required, but I would rather have the platforms doing most of the job under a framework of legislation enacted by countries, enacted by the state. But the difficulty here is that there are millions, maybe billions of posts every day. So it's very difficult to have any sort of human control of that. That has to be done through algorithms with all the problems with opacity that the algorithms bring, and with the mistakes that they make. I recently ran into two of them. They removed a breast cancer campaign as pornography, and they removed that famous picture of the girl fleeing the napalm attack as child pornography. So algorithm will make mistakes, but there's no way that you can control everything that's posted. And the countries are, and I need to end, discussing the best way to establish platform liability. So you have strict liability, which I think would be very harmful. We have, in some places, liability after a private notification, as I understand is the DSA proposal. And in Brazil, the established law is liability after the first judicial order to remove content. That's what we've been practicing in Brazil. There's a statute that says that. It has been challenged before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has not decided. There's no judgment on that. But the extent of the platform liability is also something that we will be discussing. And of course, it's very important that society as a whole become aware of the dangers of circulating misinformation. So, and I'll be happy to talk about our experience in Brazil. I was the head of the Electoral Court, and in the past elections, I dealt with all the platforms. We celebrated partnerships with all of them to fight unauthentic behavior and to remove illicit content. It has worked, I would say, fairly well. The platforms had a change of heart over the years. At first, they would not discuss. They would say, we are just the avenue through which the information circulates. We don't want to interfere. And I think they lost a lot of prestige because they were used against democracy, and I think they had a change of heart, maybe not totally, but to a certain extent. And we entered good agreements, and we were able to fight disinformation in the last elections in Brazil. So my conclusions, Ambassador and Mr. Jelassi, are the following. The World Wide Web has provided access to knowledge, information, and public space to billions of people, changing the course of history. However, the misuse of the internet and social media can pose a serious threat to democracy and fundamental rights. Second, confronting inauthentic behavior and illegitimate content is inevitable and requires proper regulation. It is essential, however, to act with proportionality and adequate procedures so that pluralism, diversity, and freedom of expression are not compromised. And finally, media education and awareness of people of good faith, who fortunately constitute a large majority, are decisive measures for the positive and constructive use of the new technologies. So, Ambassador, these are the ideas I would like to launch here, and I'll be happy to discuss further with anyone that's interested. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Barroso, for your rich and very substantive presentation. If you allow me 2 quick remarks. You talked about the place leading the way to the space. We moved from physical place, a room like this one where we meet, to the digital space, which is borderless, which is global. I think with that, we saw two forces that coming together that used to be mutually exclusive, reach and richness. We can reach, you said, 3 billion people easily. Richness of information, truly multimedia, videos, photos, interactive. So in the past, we couldn't have reach and richness together at an economic or economically affordable way. Today, through the internet, we have both at zero cost, 0 cent. The second remark is you mentioned the business model of digital platforms, which some people call the digital surveillance capitalism. We observe what you do online. We catch your clicks. We analyze your click stream, and then we know who you are, what you are interested in. We link you up with advertisers, with product service sellers, etc. So it's a new capitalism based on digital surveillance. The more clicks, the more ads, the more revenues, the more profit. That's fundamentally the business model of the platform companies. As you said, at the expense of misinformation, disinformation, harmful content, hate speech online, etc. So my last remark is UNESCO will organize next February an international conference on the regulation of internet platforms, very much trying to tackle the harmful side of the platforms, which you mentioned in your presentation. This will be truly a multi-stakeholder event, including the tech companies, of course, the platform operators, to try together with our member states, civil society, academia, hopefully to come up with shared principles and actionable recommendations to regulate the new cyberspace and the new internet platforms that we all want to have. Let me stop here. We have time for questions, both from the room as well as from our online participants. So please, anybody who wants to intervene with hopefully a brief question, so we can take as many questions as we can, raise your hand or submit them online, and my colleague Guillermo Canella is watching the chat box online. So I see a first hand from my left-hand side. Sir, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, ADG Jelassi. I am the Chargé d'Affaires of Spain. Thank you very much for the organization, for the Ambassador of Canada, and for the President of the General Conference, and for Minister Barroso. It has been very, very interesting, and especially Minister Barroso, you really did a fantastic resume of the situation, and with very, very inspiring comments and very interesting. And the one that I really, for me, was more striking is one that it's not new, but really it has been throughout history. We cannot agree on the facts, and this is really a big problem. But as many of you know me, my question goes directly to what UNESCO can do on this question, because we all know what is happening. The problem is not what individuals do or private organizations do. Well, it's also. But the problem is also that many member states of UNESCO are the ones from the state that they are against freedom of expression, constant disinformation, and democracy. So we are in an organization where many member states completely disagree with this. And the result is, as we can see here, we are a small minority of member states that really we are very much interested in freedom of expression, disinformation, and democracy. But we are a minority, and the problem is not individuals or the private sector. The problem is the states that really directly, because I'm sure because you didn't have time, but there is also a question about the general system of education. In many of our democracies, we have this free general system of education since the middle of the 20th century. And in our countries, we have this problem of we can see this easiness of disinformation from people that theoretically have had 15 years of general education. So this is a very important problem, the question of education, which is not at this moment tackling this problem. And it's not solving this problem because in many of our countries, we have this general populism and all the things you said about of sensationalism, sentimentally better than rationality. So what can UNESCO do apart from Hamlet's answer to Polonius? Words, words, words. What can UNESCO do apart of documents, general documents about ethics? Yeah, they are very interesting. But the reality is that we have a constant problem. We have a war in Europe, which is a very good example of permanent disinformation. We have wars, we have this general situation of persecution of journalists and freedom of speech. My impression is that UNESCO doesn't do, we haven't yet, we don't know what to do with that really is effective apart from words and documents. And this is the question. Just to finish, let me just quote the Martinique French novelist that said, "We won't change the world if we don't change the imaginary." What Nietzsche said, we will always have the same gods if we don't change our grammar. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll answer very quickly. I think, sir, there are two questions here. The traditional enemy of freedom of expression was the state. So we were all prepared to fight improper intervention of the state in freedom of expression. And as you said, many countries have not won this battle yet. That's one problem. But now we are facing a different problem, which are the risks brought to freedom of expression, not by public actors, but by private actors that occupy a very large public space. So this is the novelty here. So you raised one problem, states that do not respect or preserve freedom of expression, which is a major problem. It's a battle that still needs to be fought in many places. And this new battle that we are facing now with private actors dominating the public space. And I, of course, cannot talk about what UNESCO could do, but my guess would be, as our chair today has mentioned, I think the main role of UNESCO is building awareness, bringing digital education, because crime will always exist in any area. So what we try to do is to educate people, is to alert people, is to teach people to behave well. And then crime becomes something residual. So I hope that misinformation over time, with the awareness of society, will also become something marginal as robbery or homicides or rapes or any other crimes. You can't eliminate, but it's, of course, not the mainstream of society, as unfortunately many times is the mainstream in social media. So that's what we need to fight. And I would say bring awareness to civil society is the major role we can play, I'd say.
If you allow me to say a word, since the question is about what UNESCO is doing. Mr. Chargé d'Affaires d'Espagne, before your intervention, I mentioned the major international conference that UNESCO is working on right now to take place this coming February with private sector, technology company, platform operators involved, in addition to the member states, of course, to tackle these issues, the harmful side of the internet, as our speaker eloquently exposed. That's one major action. We are, as you know very well, UNESCO is a center of a multi-stakeholder hub. We want to involve all stakeholders around the table to agree on a set of principles, on actionable recommendations. This is not talk, it's action. And they invite, of course, all member states to join us, to tell us what actions we are not doing that you suggest us to do. we work together. Secretariat works with member states, of course. We take initiatives, but of course we listen to member states all the time, and we engage together for what you think is proper for us to do. So I'm making a call to all member states beyond this initiative, which our Director General announced last May, the conference. Of course, all our work on the World Press Freedom Conference, the World Press Freedom Day, all publications, as our speaker said, this help increase awareness, help in terms of advocacy, but also a last action I would mention briefly is our work on media and information literacy and how to integrate it into the educational system of countries. This is fundamental because, as the speaker said, who are the 2-3 billion people spending hours per day on social media? They are mainly the youth spending hours per day. Have we educated them in primary school, secondary school? Have we exposed them to media and information literacy and how they can possibly distinguish between false information or misleading information and verified, checked information before they like, before they share, before they disseminate? So our work on media and information literacy, which has become a strategic priority of UNESCO as of this year, I think is fundamental action-wise to educate, to change the mindset, and hopefully improve the behavior online. This is very briefly put, but again, I invite member states to engage with us, the Secretariat at large, and the CI sector, the communication and information sector in particular, since we are leading this initiative, and other sectors have their initiatives as well. We don't have the exclusivity on this matter within CI. Additional questions from the room? So let me, Guillermo, let's take one from the room and one online for fairness purpose. So can you give us one question online, please?
There are, I guess, three very straightforward questions online. One, Minister, is how to deal with the fact that the business models of these companies might increase the levels of polarization in situations where there is already a lot of tension. So how to deal with that? The second one, what is the right balance between having human moderators for this content and these problems like disinformation, hate speech, and having artificial intelligence doing the moderation? So how important is to have both, and how is the right balance? And there is a third one, also straightforward. One thing is to develop regulation for the content that is publicly available in Facebook posts or YouTube videos. The other thing is how to deal with the encrypted services, like WhatsApp, etc., that, like in the case of Brazil, for instance, had a huge impact in the elections. Bear in mind that encryption is also important to protect human rights in many situations. So those are three straightforward questions from the online participation.
Mr. Minister, would you mind if we take three questions from the floor to finish with a round of questions, and then we let you please address all of them?
No problem.
For the sake of time. So we go from right to left, please, sir.
Dear Minister, thank you so much for your remarks. I'm coming Grenier from the Forum on Information and Democracy, an NGO developing policy recommendations for all the topics that you raised today. I just wanted to have your reflection on the Oversight Board, because you were talking about the self-regulation of platforms, and have your reflection. It has been perceived as a Supreme Court. Do you see that as competition, or is it complementary to your work? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Next question, please. The lady in the center.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for this meeting. I appreciate all the speech that you gave us and the debate that you opened. And I have a question for Minister Luís related to regulation, because there is always this debate between freedom of expression and regulation everywhere. I come from Argentina, so I know you know the situation in Latin America. And my question is, how can you imagine this regulation if you think it should be in a regional level, for instance, Mercosur in Latin America, like the discussion that is going on here in Europe, or in a national level or an international level, how maybe the UNESCO promotes, and how do you think it could be this regulation in the relation between public and private and civil society? Because usually, and you say something like there is a challenge for the civil society, and that is related to digital alphabetization, maybe, but in society with big inequalities, like in our region, in Latin America, it's difficult to think to give all the responsibility to civil society that have another basic needs that are not covered. So we come again to the responsibility of the state, but it's always the debate again between the state that does not become a dictatorship or an authoritarian for regulation, but it's only that have the capability, the capacity to regulate. So how can you imagine this contradiction or this challenge?
Thank you very much. I saw a hand here, please.
Thank you, ADG. My name is Xian Hong from CS sector. I agree with all those tremendous challenges as Minister Luís well set out. So what can be a part of solution, particularly not only UNESCO, but also United Nations? Because that, as you know, that the Secretary General of UN has launched the digital cooperation map and also our common agenda aiming to formulate a global digital compact, which I understand can help hold the member states, governments accountable in implementing international standards, including free expression, privacy, etc. So what do you think about that? How can UNESCO, as a part of UN, to be a part of the solution? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last two questions, please, and briefly. Yes. Yes, sir. We can. But maybe the translators cannot hear you. So you have to use the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very quick question. There are elections coming up in Brazil, very important elections. I was wondering if you had specific examples of misinformation that you are worried might taint the public debate around these elections, and what do you hope that the internet platforms, the social media, would do about these misinformation claims?
Thank you very much. Last question, please.
Yes. Hello, my name is Mehdi Benchela. I'm a senior project officer here working with Guillaume Canella and the Section for Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists. And so I had one very concrete, because I'm working on media and election on this field, on this handbook, which is just actually launched today. And so my first is really very concretely, how did you engage with the platform in Brazil? How did you bring them around the table to really engage, to really change, and to limit disinformation, misinformation during election period? I think it would be very interesting for us to see this concrete example, and that might be useful in other countries, under other context, especially with the judiciary power. My other point is not really a question, but just an observation. You are very balanced in your presentation, and I appreciate that. But I'm a little bit concerned sometimes about the presentation of an evolution of this, with more freedom of expression thanks to the social media and internet, which is a little bit gloomy, and I found not always completely balanced, because, of course, we have, as humans, we're biased to sensational and worrisome, very things which are dangerous for us. Hate and these kind of things, but there are a lot of also good things that are happening, but are not as visible. You mentioned the crime rate. Actually, we have seen a lower crime rate in humanity, much lower. There is much less homicide today than 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But very few people would have this feeling. Very few people. But if you look just at the statistic, just the fact from UNODC, it's like 1/10 of the crimes. And all the other source of violence are probably decreased also. So, but this is just an observation about the fact that we tend to focus on the problems, but actually this advancement of the internet also allowed a lot of people who couldn't express themselves, couldn't go through the gatekeepers of the media in some cases, to now express themselves. And sometimes it's messy, but sometimes we have to accept that.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for these questions. The floor back to Minister Barroso.
Well, I'll try to address all of them very objectively, Mr. Chairman. As for polarization, I think that's the main problem we are facing in the world today. Polarization, to a certain extent, has always existed. Different views of the world. It's part of history. Like if we go back to the foundation of the U.S. At the beginning, you had the Federalists and Republicans at the start. Here in France, you had the left and the right at the National Assembly at the start. My generation lived through the tension between socialism and capitalism. So polarization has always existed. What I think that it's new is the hate, the anger, the incapacity of discussing ideas, and I think that's a product of tribalization, and I think the main solution is trying to create a public space of shared objective facts. I think that's the goal we need to strive for, to create a common public space. And from there, people can disagree. There is an ethical issue there. Like, let me give you a Brazilian example. The deforestation of the Amazon has grown from 4,000 square kilometers in 2012 to about 17,000 square kilometers this year, which is a shame. This is a fact. After this fact, you can have whatever opinion you think. Some people think that the forest is a problem, not a solution. I disagree, but it's an opinion. But you cannot deny the fact. What has occurred in the world is that there is a view that you can just create a false narrative to support your views. And that's an ethical problem, more than a political problem, that we need to face. So the problem, I think the solution for polarization is trying to create a public space to be shared by everyone, and that's why I insist in a plural professional press as the solution. As for human moderation, excuse me, there's no way it can be done extensively, because we're talking about millions or maybe billions of posts every day. So it has to be through artificial intelligence and algorithms with all its opacity, and of course transparency, because I think the platforms should be clear about what they amplify and what they reduce in reach, and for what reasons, and what's advertisement, what's political advertisement. So I think transparency is very important and can be easily or fairly done. But human control of everything that's posted, it's just impossible. And as for encrypted messages, well, I'm in favor of it. I think that privacy is very important. And that, so we need to distinguish between platforms like Facebook or Instagram and messaging apps like WhatsApp and Telegram. And I think encrypted is what in Brazil we did was to forbid bulk messaging, bulk unsolicited messaging as political campaign, which was very important in the past elections. As for the oversight board, Facebook, I think that's a good idea. I think we need 3 levels of regulation. State regulation, just a framework, and very moderate. Self-regulation with the terms of use. And guidelines that would come from the state framework, but that would be enforced by the platforms. And the way I see it, we probably should have a external civil society body monitoring, not only civil society, a mixed body with platforms representatives, government representatives, but the majority of civil society represented in this external board to monitor if the platforms are complying with the proper regulations. So not only self-regulation and not only state regulation, but a civil society oversight adding up to that framework. More than one person mentioned, I think it's very interesting. I didn't have the time to read thoroughly the recommendations by UNESCO regarding ethics in artificial intelligence. I just went quickly through it, but I found it very interesting that you can point out the major principles and recommend certain behaviors. And I think that would be very important for many countries where enacting legislation is more difficult to have, as the lady mentioned, international guidelines and international standards helping countries deal with this problem. So we would have international guidelines, state regulation, self-regulation, and what we call regulated self-regulation, which is the self-application of state regulations. I think it's a good idea. We need many levels. This is something new, and a debate like this, you know, helps clarifying many ideas and getting different impressions. As for election in Brazil, there's no way. In Brazil, we have this electoral justice. The elections are organized by a centralized body with the state branches, and it's the judiciary that organizes the elections. And we have, since 1996, an electronic voting system that has eliminated fraud in Brazil. Totally. There has not been one single case of fraud documented in Brazil since 1996. It was an outstanding achievement. For some reason that it's hard to understand, more recently the president himself attacks the system and says that there has been fraud, he has no evidence, and he says that it's a typical discourse. If I lose, there was something wrong there. There has not been. So the misinformation, it's sad to say, but the misinformation we fight in Brazil comes from the government, not from Congress, not from the people, and it's been a problem. But we have won the battle because the president tried to go back to paper vote, he lost, and the majority of the Brazilian society trusts the system. So, but every single day, the president attacks the system with no evidence. And of course, if you are in the press every day, that creates a kind of distrust in part of the population, or at least in part of his supporters. The same thing has happened in the US, I'm sorry to say. And according to the press, 70% of the Republicans think that the elections were stolen, although there's no evidence whatsoever. So it's this belief that if I repeat a lie many times, it might become true. It's very sad, and it's more than a political problem we're facing in the world. It's an ethical problem. It's the belief that the lie, the repeated lie, is a legitimate way of conquering support. It's sadder than just being a political dispute. It's a moral issue that we have here, unfortunately. The way we did, I just called all the platforms. The court called, and we negotiated agreements with Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, TikTok, and Twitter, and with different tools for each of them. Mostly, we established a direct communication to remove misinformation regarding the electoral process. We don't interfere in the debate between the candidates. If one candidate offends the other, you need to go to court. But the way we dealt with misinformation was to protect democracy and to protect the system against the attacks, because authoritarian populism uses as one of its tools to attack the democratic system and to say that the electoral system is rigged, and if it's rigged, it's not democratic. If it's not democratic, I can seize power by violence or by any other means. So we were able to defend the system, I think, very effectively. Telegram didn't want to come. And Telegram has become, in Brazil, the main vehicle for misinformation. So as I was president, I said more than once, if you don't come and abide by Brazilian laws, you won't be here. We are going to prohibit you being here, which is not very easy. But we had to say that, and they still didn't come. And then one of the justices in one inquiry at the Supreme Court said, if you don't remove this content here, I'm going to suspend you. So they finally came and accepted to enter an agreement with us. I spoke with the German ambassador at the time because Germany had entered an agreement with Telegram to remove content. So we got some information. But what he said is we are going to find them in the European Union. I said, well, I can't do that from Brazil. But the upper side was, in Germany, they had 9 million users. In Brazil, they had 50 million users. So we were a much more important market for them than Germany. So the threat that they would be removed made them come to the table, and they entered an agreement. And they said that they missed my email, but they finally found it, and they entered this partnership. But again, as I said, the platforms, they had a change of heart, and they've been helpful in many ways. But of course, they still depend on the clicks. So it's kind of a divided heart. It's a change of heart, but it's a divided heart that we still need to deal with. And finally, I totally agree that the internet brought many good things, many good things. In my court, for example, I can participate in sessions online if by any chance I can't come to the court, which was wonderful. During the pandemic, we decided in many cases online, which is what the internet helped us doing. I can, and I have done, decide from here. I'm in Paris, and I can enter the Supreme Court system and decide a case or move whatever move I need to do in the lawsuit. So I think life is much better and much easier. I'm not the type of people that think the world is bad and getting worse. And as for crime rate, as you mentioned, there's a book that came out a few years ago called Enlightenment Now by a Harvard professor. I'll remember his name in a minute. Pinker, Steven Pinker, where he shows how the world has improved in the past 100 years. So I'm not the kind of guy, like in this story a friend of mine likes to tell. The guy went to a doctor, and the doctor said, I have bad news for you. I have bad news, and I have worse news. Okay, give me the bad ones first. And he says, you only have 20 hours of life. And he asks, what can be worse than that? I've been meaning to tell you since yesterday. So I'm not that type of person. I have now I won't say an optimistic, but a constructive view, and I think we can improve many things. And as we lower crime rate generally, I think we can lower misinformation and hate speech and other misbehaviors on the internet by civilizing people, by educating people, by bringing awareness to people. I do believe that most people have good faith, and many times they do wrong things because they don't know better, So we go back to education, as our friend from Spain mentioned at the beginning. I think education is the best way to deal with the internet and with misinformation. Generally, I hope, Mr. Chairman, I have addressed all the issues. I know it's kind of superficial, but it's the time we have. And I want to thank you very much, you all, for the invitation, for the opportunity to listen to you and your apprehensions, and for allowing me to share some thoughts and ideas and concerns in this matter, which I think will occupy our lives for the years to come. I think social media and artificial intelligence will be in our agenda quite a lot in the coming years, and we need to deal with the advantages. Like I'm a judge, and the judiciary all over the world is crowded, is slow, and it renders a service that no one is satisfied. And of course, we need to use artificial intelligence to improve it and face the risks of artificial intelligence with the opacity of the algorithms, with the discriminatory effects of the algorithms, with machine learning, which is because artificial intelligence is fed with data that, with the input that men or women put there. But with machine learning, they develop a way of reasoning that sometimes it's not clear enough, and that's going to be a problem if you're using artificial intelligence to decide cases. So we're going to be busy for the next years, I think.
Thank you very much, Minister Barroso. This concludes our session. Thank you for staying over time, but I think the topic is so rich, so substantive, that it warrants that you stay some extra time. I would like to thank President Mourâo, Ambassador Cayer. The communication and information sector organizes monthly a Brainboost session. This is probably the first time that you do it in partnership with the Freedom Online Coalition, and we used to do it only internally for CI staff at headquarters and field offices. We'll open it up to all of you, and we will try to deal with these important issues for all us. Thank you very much, Minister Barroso. My thanks also to all participants physically present in the room, but also connected online. Have a great afternoon, have a good weekend, and stay safe. Bye-bye.